Good morning and a very warm welcome to this Fizzy Leadership Network Fireside Chat. I'm Catherine Santo and I'm standing in for Micaela, the Director of Fizzy, who was unable to make it today, and she sends her apologies. But welcome one and all, it's fantastic to have you joining us. I would like to open this Fireside Chat by acknowledging that wherever we are joining in from this morning, we are meeting on Aboriginal land, and I am currently on Wurundjeri land. These lands have never been ceded, and I would like to pay my respects to all elders and those who are past, present, and also emerging. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, it's terrific to have you logging in. Fizzy is a joint collaboration between RMIT and VCOS, and it's terrific to have you involved. So welcome one and all. Our topic for this final Fizzy Fireside Chat for this year could not be more relevant or timely. The topic is resilience and recovery, the road to 2021. So as exciting and triumphant the daily numbers are in Victoria at the moment, many of us feel we're kind of running out of puff after the gruelling lockdowns, but we need to keep pushing on for the long haul, and this creates some really unique leadership tasks and challenges. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our fabulous guests this morning who are here to engage in a conversation with us on this topic. Firstly, we are joined all the way from Canada by Dr. Michelle McQuaid. Michelle is a psychologist, a best-selling author and a workplace wellbeing teacher. She has a top-rated weekly podcast, Making Positive Psychology Work, which I highly recommend. And her work has been featured in Forbes, Harvard Business Review and the Wall Street Journal, to name a few. She's currently working with Family Safety Victoria on a wellbeing strategy for the family violence sector and is fresh off the back of delivering leadership and wellbeing seminars for the Fizzy Leadership Intensives to rave reviews. So a very big welcome to you, Michelle, and thank you for joining us.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks, Catherine.
And we're also joined by Tania Farha, who is the newly minted CEO of the merging Domestic Violence Resource Centre and Domestic Violence Victoria, arriving mid-year in the midst of the pandemic, just to add to the degree of challenge. Tania has had a stellar career in government with some quite remarkable portfolios. She was the Executive Director for Crime Prevention and Countering Extremism in the Department of Justice and Community Safety. She was the Executive Director for Multicultural Affairs, Social Cohesion and Equality in the Department of Premier and Cabinet. She was the CEO of the Office of Prevention and Women's Equality within the Department of Premier and Cabinet also. She worked for Victoria Police for 9 years and was responsible for reforms in family violence. And she worked for the new UN for over 4 years as a policy specialist in ending violence against women and children. Quite amazing. So we're very fortunate to have you as well. Hello to you, Tania. So what wonderful speakers for our topics this morning. For our topic, we'd like you to stay, if you could, with your cameras and microphones off, but please put any questions you have into the chat function. And please feel free to do that as you go. We'll try to allow some time towards the end of the discussion so that we can take your questions and have a bit of an interactive with our terrific guests. So let's begin, shall we? This is really quite an extraordinary time that we find ourselves in, and all organisations, as no doubt everybody who's joined us is aware, grappling with the increased demand on services, the changing business models that we're all trying to figure out and adapt to, the shifting levels of risk, the new workplace health and safety issues that we're all also grappling with, general fatigue and uncertainty, and trying to get to the end of the line at the end of this very, very challenging year. I even read with interest this morning that Victoria is looking to get a wellbeing budget, which is a move that's been encouraged by the social sectors. So really, really quite extraordinary. So I'm keen to hear from both of you about what you're seeing from where you're sitting at the moment and the work that you're doing about what those real uppermost challenges and issues are for leaders and organisations as we move now into this more recovery phase. Maybe I could start with you, Tania. What are your thoughts? What are you noticing? Thanks.
Sure. Excuse me. Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to Micaela in her absence, actually, for the invitation to be here. And I'll also just note or acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Kulin Nations here as well, so that's where I'm coming from. So I think most of you know DVVIC's a peak body, so we represent a number of specialist family violence services. We represent the sector. And I think a lot of the things you just mentioned in that intro, Catherine, about the uncertainty and health and safety issues, that's been preeminent for a lot of our services, particularly I would say the challenges of doing very complex work from home. So bringing that complexity, that trauma-informed practice into the home, you know, that's a key challenge for leaders, and to have the infrastructure and support to allow them to do that work. So the right technological platforms. I mean, I think many of the people who are probably listening know that no services stopped during COVID. All the key crisis and case management services, including accommodation, you know, emergency accommodation options, were all available all throughout the pandemic. But obviously that requires quite a strong service system to be able to meet that. And I think one of the other things is because of the demand ebbing and flowing the whole time too, there's a lot of fatigue because a lot of the specialist practitioners didn't take leave during this time because they were so committed to providing the services that were required. So one of the key issues for the sector, and this was before the pandemic as well, but became so much more pronounced, I'd say, during the pandemic, is workforce capacity, skilled workers to come in and backfill when the practitioners need to take leave. So that's a key challenge, an ongoing challenge for the sector. I think, you know, I mentioned before the challenges of working from home, not only from bringing it into the household, and I know that we're going to talk about gendered impacts and things later, but we're a very gendered workforce, obviously, in family violence, sexual assault, social services generally. So managing complex work from home, looking after your family, being separated from your peers, because often in doing this complex work, like serious and comprehensive risk assessments, your peers are a very important factor in doing that work. Being removed from that creates a whole nother level of complexity to the style and the work you're doing. I know Michelle's the expert on health and wellbeing of individuals, so I'm not going to venture there. But I think one of the other important challenges for us is to think about and consider, then what have we learnt from this lockdown, so that if we have to go back, what are the things we can improve almost immediately for the colleagues doing this really complex work from home? And I think they're all the challenges and the key issues for leaders of organisations, and they're certainly the things I'm advocating most for on behalf of the sector with government. You know, how do we support this sector to go on?
Goodness me, thank you very much for those opening comments. It's an extraordinary set of circumstances, Tania, and really a remarkable achievement to think about what has been undertaken, the adaptation that was required, and, you know, as you say, the challenges of working in incredibly complex and, you know, often traumatic circumstances from inside your own home without any of those normal boundaries or buffers, you know, people homeschooling, etc. At the same time. And I think we should really come back to that question around gender. I think that's really important. And I love your frame about, you know, what have we learnt, so that we're not just in the midst of these responses, that we're actually taking a learning frame as we go through it. Thank you. I'm keen to hear Michelle's thoughts. Are you seeing similar or different things from the work that you're doing at the moment, Michelle?
Yeah, look, I think many of the challenges that Tania touched on around that need for workforce flexibility, suddenly moving into different setups that we weren't always technically equipped for, bringing that into our homes, and especially for the kind of work that happens in the sector. I think it's not easy to do it in an office, never mind to then take it into your own home and then feel that sense of space, but the impact for other people in your environment as well. Capacity. connectivity, so the connection of our relationships with each other, to be able to have those spaces where we can reach out and debrief and know that we're supported in what's going on for us. And then the challenges of what do we learn from this, and not just with the potential risk of what if we're back here. And as you mentioned, Catherine, I'm coming to you from Toronto, where we're back in our second lockdown, pretty severe again at the moment. Hopefully we'll be done by Christmas, but to give you a sense, our numbers are about 1,500 a day. So we are like way out there at the moment. So all those challenges, I think, absolutely are key for both the sector, many other industries as well, but I think the sector has been far more in some of those frontline roles. And again, just the challenge of the issues that the sector has to navigate for themselves and each other every day. And I think, again, that question is, what have we learned, not just in case we go back to lockdown, but what can we learn from this to take forward? And this is true whenever we encounter stresses, big ones like COVID or smaller ones that we might face every day, that we have different responses that may be enacted. And a lot of that is the belief we take to the stressor. And so when we see that stressor as an opportunity for learning and growth, as Tania's saying, there's some learning in this for us all to take forward and move from, it tends to neurologically and psychologically trigger different responses in us and physiologically than when we see it as a potential threat to us. And so when we see it as that potential threat, we get more of that fight, flight and freeze, that cortisol release in our bodies so many of us are familiar with. And of course, too much of that too consistently we know is not great for us individually, but also collectively in a team. And it's worth knowing as leaders, we are highly contagious. So when we're experiencing it, you can expect it to be felt in the ripples around you. Whereas when we get that learning and growth, that challenge response to the stresses around us, we actually don't see so much of that negative cortisol impact. So part of the learnings we can take forward from this period is, what were the times I was able to reach for that learning and challenge response to stresses for myself and to help others through that as well? And what were the times where my fight or flight or fear response was triggered? And I'm a huge believer, it's not either or. You want both those stress responses. The goal here is not to get rid of the fight or flight by any stretch, but to know when it's serving us well. The last bit I'll just add is, one of the things we're increasingly coming to appreciate is when fight, flight or freeze gets triggered for us in stress because we feel under threat, we're kind of left looking over our shoulders a bit, like, is it coming back? Are we safe yet? And so there's some beautiful new research. There's a wonderful book called Burnout, The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle, has come out in the last few weeks by Amelia and Emily Nagoski. They take a very female lens to burnout. I highly recommend it. We can share it in the chat or resources for people later. But they would advocate that often we experience the fight, flight or freeze, but we don't close that stress cycle out and remind ourselves that we're safe. It's the stressor is behind us, we're safe. And so the risk is then, and particularly at this period now, we're out of lockdown in Victoria, we're coming to the end of a year where most of us have been challenged by stresses we never thought we would have to face. And so there's a moment here for us as leaders, and to help make space for our teams, to just make sure we've closed out that stress cycle by, where it's true and appropriate, signalling we're safe. Some of that threat has now passed, and we need to let some of that cortisol, or the Nagoski sisters talk about being steeped in stress juice, which I think paints such a picture. We need to just like pull the plug on that being steeped in stress juice and know that we are okay, in order to be able to allow rest and renewal to happen at this point. And that's really important before we face new challenges in 2021, to just take this space now to recover and rest wherever we can. Now, recovery, physical exercise, they suggest, is definitely the best in the science, but doesn't have to be. It can be some deep breathing. It can be good social connection. It can be laughter. It can be a good cry. For me, it's always terms of endearments. If I put that movie on, it's like the floods of tears start coming. It can be creative expression, get out the paintbrushes or whatever you need, or affection. And I loved one of their tips out of science is not just like a hug for somebody, body, but as you hug, leaning your bodies kind of in towards each other and trying to hold on there for about 20 seconds if you can, get some of the oxytocin coming back through us. So I live in a house with a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old boy, and so bless them, since I've read this, they're dodging me every time they see me coming down the stairs because they know they're about to get a lean-in hug and I won't let go. So just thinking, how do we as leaders and for our teams use this moment between now and that Christmas period, wherever we can, to just make some space for recovery and for some rest and renewal to happen. And 2 minutes of recovery with some deep breathing is better than no minutes at all. So we need to get past the "I'm too busy" excuse that often comes with these self-care practices.
Wow, that's quite a list. Thank you very much, Michelle. It's interesting to think about that closing of the stress cycle. That's something that I hadn't been thinking about, and I think, you know, our hearts go out to you there, and you know, those numbers are very, very hard to hear. And I think here, you know, having been in lockdown 1 and then a short time in lockdown 2, there's a lot of that anxiety about, you know, and being out in the shops, you know, there's just people everywhere, as if there is no pandemic and there never was and there isn't still. And you think, oh my goodness, you know, is this all going to rise up? So closing that loop and allowing for that sense of completion there, but allowing those chemicals to do their thing sounds really good advice. I'm wondering in that, so these sounds like very small things that you could do, Michelle, in short sort of 2 minutes. And I guess one of the things that's really striking me at the moment is just what we are going into at this time of the year, understanding that in a good year, particularly in the family violence sector and the organisations that Tania's working with, this is, under good conditions, a really peak time. You know, we know that violence increases, suicide attempts increase, you know, the anxiety of being with your loved ones, as promising as that might seem, doesn't always flow through. There's a lot of stresses that then flow onto major challenges for individuals and families. So facing that, coming off the back of this incredible time and the fatigue and the challenge that's already there. So how do we go about, you know, trying to ease those pressures at the organisational and system level and really try to create that space and recovery, space for recovery and resilience with that really quite unprecedented backdrop. Tania, what are your thoughts from a organisation system level and knowing, you know, what is likely to be coming? How do we create that space and capacity to do this work?
Thanks, Catherine, and I really enjoyed, Michelle, that those tips. Actually, I'll use them myself. No young boys to hug though, but maybe pets, but all good.
Pets work just as well.
Thanks. I think, you know, when I think about recovery and the individual at the centre of the recovery, I think of an ecological model. You know, you have your structure and your systems, your organisations, and then your individual benefiting from the enablers that are around the individual, I think. And so I think when we think about recovery and resilience, we have to think at all 3 levels. So I'm going to speak really at the structural and systemic level. So I see the structural and systemic is really about the context in which individuals are operating in a system. So is the system operating well enough for the individuals to do their work with the level of ease that is required? And some of the structural things that underpin that are things about pay and conditions, recognition of work, recognition of speciality and practice, and the importance of the understanding around the complexity, and all of that being, I guess, addressed in the context of developing a system, looking at some of the structural deficits we've seen in the family violence sector, which really have been around not just workforce capacity, but pay and conditions and, you know, remuneration for the level of complexity and specialisation of this work. And I think, you know, there is, you know, the need for how do we also develop an opportunity for people to share space, I guess, like to back each other in when's required, and an organisation setting itself up can allow that to happen, but it needs the infrastructure to do that. So it needs access to good technology, access to, all the requirements, particularly in a pandemic. We've had all the COVID safe, multiple regulations and rules and laws, things changing quickly and being adapted, and quite high levels of burden to meet those needs of health and safety. So what is the support for organisations to be able to achieve that, so that individuals can comfortably operate in that environment? So I guess I see that if some of those things are addressed at the structural and systemic level, and then at the organisation, that it's got the infrastructure to be able to see what is the demand coming in, how are they managing it, what is the data saying. If there's all the supports for organisations to do that, it then helps the individual do their job, but also focus a bit on their own health and well-being, beyond worrying about everything else that is very difficult for somebody to control. So that's my sort of, I think, my view of how the recovery and resilience could happen within an ecological model like that. So if we do it at every level, then that leaves space for the individual to sort of be able, I think, to pick up and work on some of the tips and the individual tools and things that they can engage with for safety and well-being.
Thanks, Tania. So it's interesting, yes, to think about, and for people in the audience here today, in leadership roles, what is your role then in facilitating and fostering that structural piece for your own bit of the organisation, but perhaps also for thinking organisation-wide, and what is that leadership task to really give this some primacy?
Yep. So I guess what I think is that the role of the organisation, the leader of these is to really recognise, what is happening across the system and advocating as much as they can to fill some of the gaps that they're seeing. And that they can't do that individually. They can do that as a cohort and a group, and they work very closely together. That's a role the peak has to support that as well. And that's something we're really trying hard to do now, to be able to address some of those issues.
Yep, terrific. Taking it to the whole of system level.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. What are your thoughts, Michelle? And we do hear this often, that people say we just don't have the capacity. The demand is so great. We're drowning under the weight of demand. These are all nice to do things, and if only we had the space and the time. So there is that clear leadership task that Tania's talked about at an organisation and indeed a system level, and some of that might be advocacy. But in the immediacy that we're facing now, what are your thoughts about how we create that space to do more of this and to give it the primacy that it needs?
Yeah, I think it's such an important question for us, and I love Tania's way of framing the system for us to think about at the me level, the individual, at the we level between our teams and our organisations, and then at that us level. So within the organisation, what is the context, what is the structure, what is the culture, and as a sector, what are we going to together? And I absolutely agree, from a wellbeing and resilience perspective, we see that when we don't feel properly resourced in the way we're remunerated, we're recognised, we have the technology and the systems around us to support the practicalities of doing our work, that will absolutely impact our levels of wellbeing and resilience. So there's such important pieces to keep working to get right. They take time often in systems to get right, depending on where our starting base is. And sometimes we can impact and feel like we've got a lot of control over those aspects, and other times they are a bit of work in progress. And that's where I think the sector's so fortunate, having bodies like DV Vic to be able to help advocate on their behalf and share best practices and that support. I think the suggestion I would have, and it's just that, and all the best research on caring for our wellbeing tells us what works for some of the people some of the time. And so the invitation in this is to find what works best for you and for your team as a leader. I think I would always say it's often a case of that yes, the system at the highest level needs to be addressing the issues Tania's identified, And we also need to think about what do we do at a collective care level and an individual care level that are those things within our spheres of influence and control. I think sometimes what we see in systems when it comes to wellbeing, particularly those that are in very challenging sectors and contexts, is that there can be a risk that we leave ourselves in the role of victim, expecting that the system will fix itself. And of course, as much as systems are made up of organisations and structures and processes and all those important things Tania was touching on, they are also ultimately the collection of individuals that also comprise the system. And so I do think it comes to an and maybe looking at our circles of control, our circles of influence, and what are the pieces at that system-wide level, at our team level, and at our individual level that we can impact that is going to support resilience. Because we certainly see research in other systems that have great pay and great recognition for the work being done and still have a complete absence of well-being because the other factors aren't there as well. I think we've seen a growing body of work over the last few years in the importance of psychological safety in systems, to feel like it's okay to struggle, that we're not tying ourselves in interpersonal knots with each other, that we are able to learn, to Tania's point earlier about what have we learned from this experience, and take risks, that we show up from a place of curiosity instead of judgment, and compassion instead of blame and shame with each other. So I do think it's a case of and here if we're going to build systems in which it's easier for all of us to care for our wellbeing and resilience as we go forward.
Most certainly, and I think that's a really helpful frame around, you know, just thinking at those levels that you've both talked about, and then what are those interventions that we might be able to control. So we might not be able to control everything, as you're saying, Michelle, but what are the things that we do have that we can actually start to action or put some work into? And coming back to that self as well, as you said, this is, you know, these things are contagious. So how?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even if it feels beyond our control, doesn't mean we don't lobby and ask and set, you know, for the support that we need. But I do think if we sit back waiting for systems to rescue us, there's a risk we could be waiting for a very long time. And when that comes to our wellbeing and resilience, I think it's too important to just leave it to expect systems will figure those things out for us in a timely way. They should, doesn't always happen, unfortunately.
The agency needs to kick in.
Yeah.
We've talked a bit at the beginning about the gendered impacts of COVID, particularly we're all becoming increasingly aware of the fact that the impacts haven't been shared evenly, that women in particular have borne a lot of additional stresses and strains. And I'm wondering about both of your thoughts around that understanding as we plan for recovery and to foster resilience going forward. What are the things that you think we need to be factoring in, particularly understanding now that that is very much part of the fabric of what we're dealing with? Tania, would you like to start?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's the evidence is out there already about the gendered impacts of this pandemic, both on people who've been working from home, so people who haven't lost their jobs but still in essentially doing two jobs, teaching their children in the main as well as doing the job. But then those who have lost their jobs, the most impacted being those in insecure work, which have been women, and the impact that that's had on them and their economic well-being and economic security. And I think then, you know, if you think about, though, the types of work that have come to the forefront that are required during the pandemic, the care economy essentially, you know, if we're talking about that, also very gendered workforce. and what has that mean, and what's the impact that's been on those individuals. I'm sure Michelle will have a lot to say about that. It's interesting because we're talking about COVID recovery, and we've talked about we've had a budget that just came out in here in Victoria. So I was sorry, Michelle, but
I follow it closely. So
yeah, very significant budget in Victoria, particularly around recovery. Some reasonable inputs for women too, in gender communities, and some of those other impacts about people who also have experienced other forms of inequality, both before and particularly exacerbated during the pandemic. So opportunities. But interesting, in Canada, they are promoting very much this feminist COVID recovery plan. And I found that very interesting. And I was on a panel the other day where a young woman was talking about the work that they'd done about this feminist. So very much looking at the impact on women, gender diverse communities, people who experience multiple forms of discrimination and inequality, and what's this pandemic meant, and how can they be at the forefront of recovery during this. So maybe using this as an opportunity to put us all on, a more equal level playing field, maybe, moving forward. So I guess it'd be great to have a conversation like that here in Victoria, one around then, what is, taking feminist, intersectional feminism, I guess, in its broader term. How do we do that? How do we lead on a recovery? You mentioned before about a well-being recovery. I've also heard a social recovery, a possibility of but what does that mean, and who is being focused, who is the focus, I guess, of that. So I think there's some of the discussions I would like to see happen here in Victoria. So that would be good. It'd be interesting if you had any insights from Canada, Michelle. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I agree. It's fascinating seeing what's happening here. And anytime we go through a major disruption as COVID has created across our systems, everything unfreezes. And so as much as we've seen the negative side of the impact to all those examples Tania was talking to, we've also seen over the last week in Australia that it looks like women are less likely to be enrolling for tertiary education for 2021 at the moment compared to men. We've also seen higher levels of anxiety and depression being reported in Australian women as well. So even though there, again, those challenges, right, we come back to where we started with, every stressor in and of itself is potentially neither good nor bad, but our responses to them vary. Now, again, I say that in the broad term of what the research would suggest. We've all experienced, and you guys work every day in a sector where there are some very clear bad stressors that we really don't want to have anybody having to experience. But even in those moments, and I speak from a very personal position in my family of having encountered many of those challenges and needed the support of places like the family safety sector, is that there are invitations, as hard as they are to experience at times, to learning and growth in those moments. And so as hard as the impact for women has been for COVID in Australia and other countries like Canada, for example, is taking that as a moment of going, okay, everything's shifted here. Everything's a little more liquid and less frozen than what it was pre-COVID. How do we use that while things are unsettled and disrupted to build back in a better way than where we were before? How do we take that as an invitation for learning and growth, as hard and unwelcome as it is on many fronts? But instead of getting stuck into that fight, flight or freeze, and sometimes the very understandable victim mentality that can throw us in those moments, if we think about our kind of drama triangle that we so often work with in the family sector, and think about, well, how do we go from victims to creators of this future? How do we see, instead of the systems persecuting us as women for lack of equal pay and opportunities and, equal care and all those things in the home, how do we see those as I often describe them as they're the unexpected gift. They're not the gift we chose. They were on nobody's list, but they're the gift that we have right now to create opportunities for learning and growth. And how then do we, instead of expecting anyone to rescue us, how do we coach and use opportunities like government funding, like grants coming out for wellbeing, like new ways that we might approach, care for kids while women are studying, or, sharing more of the load at home. One of the advantages in my own sample of one household is because my husband, who works for a large bank over here, is traveling, much less obviously, he's here now every night to cook dinner while I work, because I'm working to the Australian time zone partly. So again, this disruption, things being shaken out of the frozen state in which our systems were in, can create unexpected opportunities for change to happen that can be good for all of us in a way that would have been much harder before. It's not to say it's easy, but just that the possibilities there, and that's what I think Canada is really trying to seize on.
How wonderful, and let's hope we can draw on some of that experience here, particularly as our state government does contemplate this wellbeing budget. Let's hope we are using this unfreeze, refreeze kind of opportunity and capitalising on the things that were perhaps suboptimal before, that we can now start to breathe some new life into these ideas and these ways of setting some policy and some supports. There's much to be hopeful for. There's optimism as we head towards this Christmas. So I think as daunting as facing Christmas feels a bit at the moment, but thinking about that road then towards 2021, I think you've touched on some wonderful ideas already. And I think this notion of building in what we can in recovery and structuring that recovery and taking what we are in control of as leaders, as you've both suggested, but thinking about having the legs for the long haul now. The pandemic isn't over. We may well have another potentially 12 months to go at least until a vaccine kicks in. How do we now think about that resilience piece over that longer term? And really, build in what's required to support people. I'm sure a lot of it you've talked about already, but are there real sort of key milestones that we now need to think about and start as leaders to plan for, that will enable us to make that distance and to sustain ourselves and sustain our people through what's required probably well into 2021? Tania, do you want to start? Have you got other thoughts about what we need to be thinking about? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Someone had to be, it may as well have been me.
You win the prize.
I think the context, I think there's a lot of things we need to be thinking about as we move forward. And a lot of things I think we've already talked about in either, kind of a themed way or a disparate way. But I think it's about, what is the enabling environment for for an individual to be able to, I guess, care for themselves and be in and recover in that way. So I guess there are so many levels that we all have to work at, so addressing some of those inequalities. We just had that discussion about inequalities that existed before but were really pronounced during the pandemic. So providing some equity for people to be able to reach into, I think is something that we need to think about. And then I think it's really about how do we bring society, how do we come back in a cohesive way as well? I was thinking, and I remember about, the financial, the 2008 and the financial, God, I can't remember what it was called, but, the financial, what was it
financial
called?
crisis.
Meltdown.
Just
looking
at me. Yeah, the financial crisis, and remembering reading about certain research that came out of London saying societies that were more cohesive, little communities or groups where that was more cohesive, recovered more quickly from the crisis. So I assume it will be the same here, you know, in these sorts of things, both because of the financial impact, but also because of the social isolation we've experienced, and what's that meant for the social cohesion of our communities and our society, because an individual locates themselves in belonging to something, you know. So I guess that there's some of the considerations, I think, and it'd be interesting to hear from Michelle when she speaks too about how an individual situates themselves in the context of you know, I guess a social group and a socially cohesive group too. So getting a better understanding of each other, and I think the experiences of particular groups has been much more pronounced. You know, we saw here in Victoria, particularly in some of the public housing areas, about the impact that had on certain communities. And I think a lot of Victorians really could empathise with those people. They couldn't really understand, they weren't there, but they could see the impact it was having on those communities. So what does that mean for us as a community working together, rebuilding our community, our cohesion together? Because that's where an individual situates themselves. Otherwise, the social isolation that was experienced in the pandemic just prolongs or extends. So I think that's a really important thing for us to think about.
It's really important, I agree, particularly when those things you say were so disrupted. And
yeah.
And at the, you know, you spoke so eloquently at the beginning, Tania, about the disruptions from the workplace cohesion. Now, how those structures, particularly in, you know, high stress, high trauma environments, are what you rely on to sustain you, and they're taken away when people are working in their homes. So paying really conscious effort now to what's possible, perhaps in, you know, more limited settings. We've got 25% of the workforce going back now in Victoria. We may not have what we used to rely on. So how do we think about what creates that cohesion as something that will nurture resilience as we go forward? What are your thoughts, Michelle?
I think, you know, again, one of the unexpected gifts perhaps of COVID in this period in time is that it normalized struggle and it humanized, right? The lack of what happens to us when we lack that connection to, you know, we took every day for granted, but now suddenly feels like this precious gift to get to spend time face to face with each other, to work alongside each other, you know, and not just see all the little things we do that annoy each other, but hey, it's amazing that you're there, you know, as we get back into workplaces. And I share Tania's hope that perhaps in that humanising, that we all struggle at times, which we knew before, but perhaps just had not all struggled so collectively around similar issues before, that it has opened us to be more compassionate for each other, and to feel a little safer with each other in our shared humanity around what it is to be trying to navigate our way through this life as best we can at work and at home, and knowing that that is challenging for us. I think there's so much in the sector that we have around trauma and violence informed practice that helps us create those cultures of care as we come back together. And again, I think so often we are wonderful at extending those practices to our clients and the people that we support, but not always so great at using them to support each other. I know not true in all cases, but I think often we are the cobbler's children who are in the worst, worst shoes in the neighbourhood. And so there's an opportunity here. Again, we've kind of unfrozen and diluted some of those workplace cultures and systems and things that we had pre-COVID. And there's a chance here to be intentional, to bring our compassion to the fore, to use the skills that we already have as leaders and as a sector, and think about how we build back better for the workplaces that will support wellbeing and resilience, whilst also addressing those more systemic issues that Tania so rightly pointed out. I'm a big fan of Vicki Reynolds' work. In fact, we're interviewing her for the podcast next week. So if you've got questions for Vicki, send them to me and I'll ask her. But I love her work also around collective care and how do we build cultures of collective care, and particularly her pieces around collective accountability. Yeah, and to me, part of collective accountability is not letting any of us individually or as a team or a workplace sit for too long in that place of victim. If we go back to our drama triangle, absolutely, to acknowledge what is hard, what is not fair, what should not be happening that way. But then we find in our research with leaders, the most effective leaders when it comes to wellbeing, resilience, and the likelihood of creating successful change are leaders who invite. In Vicky's work, she talks about sharing the power. So as a leader, it's not my job to have all the answers and all the things figured out. It's my job to create safe spaces and invite people into that space together to talk about what's meaningful for us, what's purposeful, what is our shared hope, and then also to inquire, to allow space for self-organisation, to trust and see what people care enough to own, to build forward together. So instead of trying to enforce my will and what I think is the best idea as a leader, to trust myself and my people, that my job then is to track and fan those opportunities of accountability and ownership that will make the biggest difference for us as we go forward together and build the kind of workplaces we can all thrive in. And so that would be my thought. Again, I think Vicky's work around cultures of collective care, definitely worth digging back out as this moment as leaders, and to think about how we create those safe spaces where our job as a leader is to invite what's important to people now, what kind of workplaces and teams do we want to create, and then inquire what do they care enough to own, and trust and resource and support them to help build the organisations and teams we all want to be part of.
It's a terrific notion, the cultures of collective care, and I'm reminded of a discussion we had in our leadership intensives with Fizzy about wellbeing being a political act. You know, it's something that we can choose and we can feel empowered. You know, if that's not in the system or enough in the system at the moment, if we are in the cobblers category, that we can actually choose to do something differently. And ironically, many of these organisations and the sectors had the skills. As you say, we do it with the clients.
We do it all the time. It's just like, now it's time to care for us. In order, to your point, that it's a political act. I mean, the truth is you cannot keep pouring and pouring from a jug into others that you never refill. And so I think often, you know, self-care feels like a selfish thing. We're not, you know, we should come last in this. But, you know, self-care, as much as I know sometimes in the sector it gets a bad rap, you know, even in Vicky's work, she talks about you can't collective care without self-care as part of it as well. And so rather than seeing self-care as an act of selfishness or weakness, that we need self-care because we're not resilient enough, but seeing it as that political act, because think about the resilience and energy it requires to keep fighting the good fight for the changes that you want to create. If you're not looking after you, it's hard to expect anybody else is going to come and look after you as well.
Take the permission. The old put your own face mask on first, oxygen mask on first.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a must do, not a nice to do. Now, I think we just had a question coming through, which is very exciting, but it seems to have gone off my screen. I'm going to check for that. Okay, no, it's vanished. All right, if you've got any questions, we've got a little bit of time still to go, so by all means jump on in and ask any questions that you might have, but also take up Michelle's offer if you've got questions for Vicky Reynolds that you'd like her to answer in the podcast. That would be really cool too. And I guess that also leads me to think about, you know, other resources that people can access from here on in. I think we've touched on some fantastic content, and I'm feeling recharged just listening to you both, so I'm hoping everybody else is as well. But some thoughts about, you know, where people can go to get some more thinking and some more injections like this that keeps us going for the long haul would be really very cool. Oh, someone was just about to pop into your room.
Yeah, they know not to. They open the door a peek and it's like, how many people on the screen? No, now is not the time. So I mentioned, Catherine, the Burnout book by the Emily and Amelia Nagoski. They did a beautiful podcast with Brené Brown recently on her Unlocking Us podcast, which is on pretty much every podcasting platform, probably about 4 weeks ago. But I do highly recommend the book again, that they take a beautiful lens to the political activism around the stress cycle and care, and talk beautifully also about why self-compassion can be so hard for so many of us who are always busy caring for other people. We'll send through a little poster that you can share on rest and recovery, a little toolkit, so you can stick it on the wall for all those little ways that you can remember based on their work. I would definitely suggest as well. Again, I think as much as anything, keep reaching out to each other. This is a good time as leaders to just say, man, what a year, you know, what went well this year? Where did we struggle? What did we learn, to Tania's question? And based on that, how do we want to go forward into 2021? And again, knowing this can be Christmas, such a challenging time still in the sector, just help looking out for each other. We've been doing some beautiful work across the outer east region in Victoria the last few months. And, you know, one of the leaders of that on Friday, you know, role modelled the act of rest and recovery and took herself off for the day, which is almost unheard of. So again, think about, as leaders, you're highly contagious, you're sending important signals here. What you role model absolutely sets a permission for your team to be able to recover and rest as well.
Very sound advice, thank you.
Can I just say something? Nothing, sorry, I don't have any additional resources to add, but nor would I dare, actually, because Michelle's got them all anyway. But I was just thinking about Michelle's son coming in the door there. That's one interesting thing about this pandemic, the humanising of people in the context in which they live. You know, everyone has, you know, like they either, you know, their pets or their children walking across the screen. And I remember the thing about the British politician where, you know, she's trying to give some, you know, very serious answer to something, and the child's coming in. So, you know, that there have been some very interesting humanising elements of what is essentially been a technological existence, you know, through Zoom and things. And I wonder what that does to our relationships, because unless you're friends with your work colleagues, you don't see them in their home lives. But, you know, yeah, it's been interesting, and I don't know what that will mean moving forward too.
I think, again, Tania, it maybe helps us feel a little more compassion for each other, right? To go, oh, it's not all perfect over there, it's mess and it's magic. And that's true, right? That's the human condition, is mess and magic. And I've definitely had mine think he can crawl across the floor and no one will see him. It's like, oh, everyone can see your butt now. Like, you might as well stand up and walk. Well, in our team, we're a virtual team, and so we chat in Slack as a messaging way to stay. But we share each week, at the start of our week, we share what you probably don't know about me. And this has been a really little easy activity. You could share it in team calls as well, but it's been a beautiful way to get to know more of those other parts of each other's lives than just the work face that we bring. And again, I think the more we can see each other for the mess and magic, the perfect imperfection we each are, the easier it is to extend compassion to each other, but also to ourselves as well.
Been a very surprising sort of part of it, hasn't it? And it's so leveling in a way, as well as bringing in the sort of the humanism of it, and perhaps even at the individual level, being able to let go of some of those expectations of yourself a bit. Just go, it's all right to just be, and let it all hang out a little bit more. We do have a couple of questions. Georgia has said, this year we realised that nearly all services can be delivered online, aside from some members of our community not having access, I think, to the internet. I think this has mostly been positive. We decreased cost of providing services by removing a lot of overheads and removed travel barriers for rural Victorians. Do you all agree this has been a positive outcome of COVID? What will online services look like in 2021? So, what are your thoughts? Has it been positive? And putting on your futurist hats, do you think, what will 2021 look like in terms of online service delivery? Tania, do you have thoughts based on your peak body perspective?
Well, I would say this, you know, interestingly, you know, we have these regular catch-ups with our members once a month in order to talk about the pertinent operational or sometimes strategic issues in the sector. And interestingly, this year, because we've had to do them online, we've had a much higher rate of participation, of course, because people don't have to travel, particularly from the rural and regional areas. So they can engage. So I guess one of the positive things coming out of this is that we know we have to offer this both ways moving forward, like maybe some in-person opportunities, but also still provide it in terms of remote access. So that's been interesting. I think that, and I'm not sure yet, and I think we need to do a little bit more analysis, but has there been any positive impact for delivering case management and crisis responses online? I mean, obviously there's been hampered by, in many instances, having the perpetrator there 24/7, but was that not the case? Would there be some benefit to that provision of service? I think we still need to do some analysis and work out what works for people, and maybe it's a mixture. And if this allows us the opportunity to provide a broad variety of opportunities, then that's also something we can learn from, I think. So they were just some of the two things that I was thinking about, maybe what were some opportunities, kind of, in contrast to the, isolation and the lack of human kind of interaction, etc. But yeah, I'm not sure what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I would say again, I think it's the and, right? This period has shown us ways that we can be flexible in ways we probably didn't think we could before. And so to Tania's point, and it's kind of coming back to that leadership style of inviting and inquiring as you go forward to figure out what does it look like in a new world. And perhaps there is a bit more diversity and balance of opportunities there that improve accessibility and participation and power sharing across more places.
Terrific, thank you. And the last question, I think, does bring us back to the heart of some of the challenge here. How can we realistically hold managers and staff in the balance between the demand and stress in trauma work on COVID-weary staff and the wellbeing talk? Even if the focus is on wellbeing, this doesn't change the day-to-day demand on an individual worker.
Yeah. So I would just say, be transparent about the challenge, right? It's nobody's challenge, not the sector's challenge, it's not the organisation's, it's not yours as a leader, it's not the staff's challenge to solve alone. Yeah, this is a real and complex and difficult and at times painful challenge. Yeah. And so like any struggle, the best way there is to be able to talk about it rather than pretending if I don't look, it's not happening, or to stay stuck kind of blaming and shaming and pointing fingers in different. This will not be solved by any one part of the sector alone. It is going to take brave conversation, psychologically safe conversation to keep finding the right balance, to keep experimenting and talking about what's working, where are we still struggling, what do we learn from this? But if we're not willing to enter those conversations, then nothing here ever changes.
To add to that, I agree with Michelle, but I think this is where the structural and systemic issues are really, really significant. So thanks, Giselle, for that question, because in the end, the only way to manage is to put some extra support for, for staff to be relieved from doing the work, and that's where things like workforce capacity, organisational infrastructure, these are all the things that really support an individual. But I agree 100% with Michelle, there's no one approach, you've got to keep working it through, but that's why all three things have to interact together. It's what I believe anyway.
Yeah, I agree, Tania. I think it's definitely the end, but I also think waiting just for that to happen, nothing would make me happier than better capacity and better pay, and I'm completely on board all those things. And while those things are being put in place, thinking about how we help people day to day here as well. Yeah.
We have a lovely final comment because we're out of time from Anonymous. Thank you for posting, Anonymous. Bob Dylan and Van back then saying the times they are changing. I think our times have changed over the year, and like this year we had to adapt to the way we used to do things, then learn new ways how to overcome the ways within the COVID-19 too. And I think that's a nice end point. Certainly been steeped in change, more to come, but the message of this is we have a lot in our sphere of control as leaders. And both of you have pointed to some toolkits and some signposts and the things that we can do to create that space and capacity and look afresh at what we're doing for ourselves, for our team, within our organisations, what we can advocate for at the sector kind of level to really shape what we're doing for ourselves and our people and our organisations in the coming year. Despite all of the challenges, there's plenty that we can actually do. So please join me silently from wherever you are, or noisily if you'd like to, in thanking our two guests very much indeed. Michelle McQuaid and Tania Farha, thank you for your very rich and generous presentations and discussions here today. It's been absolutely wonderful to get your expertise and your views and your thoughts, your experiences. How do we focus on and approach this recovery and resilience phase now as we move towards the end of the year and into the next? Thank you very much indeed. All the very best to you and yours for the festive seasons. Stay safe, stay well, and Michelle, go well in Canada. You two come out the other side as we are here, and all the best to you and your family in the meantime. Thank you very much, everybody. Wonderful to have you on board. Very best wishes from Fizzy and the team. Take care.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Tania. Bye.
Bye-bye.